Look, I'll be honest, this was supposed to be 5-minute history, the series where patrons choose the topic, and a patron did choose this topic. So you get it in December for as part of TANKMAS, but I got carried away. So yeah, about those 5 minutes, well, strap in. Japanese tanks have a really bad reputation when it comes to the Second World War, and the Hargo light tank stands as one of the poster children for this kind of reputation. Designed in the 1930s, it was intended to provide Japan's military with a mobile, lightly armoured vehicle suitable specifically for operations in Asia. Keeping in mind Asia is dominated by extremely thick forests, jungles, and is very mountainous in certain regions. The Hargo would actually be pretty effective in this role, but when it came to the Pacific War on islands, and well in the Philippines as well, it would be completely outmatched by Allied armour as the war progressed. Nevertheless, its design, service history, and legacy reveal a fair bit about Japan's strategic priorities, technological capabilities, and doctrines, and, well, politics, during the war. And to be completely honest, this tank does not deserve in the slightest the amount of hate it gets. The origins of the Type 95 Hargo date back to Japan's experiences during the early 1930s in Manchuria. I'm not going to go into the politics of it too far, but long story short is that Japan and Russia had spent the last few decades going back and forth on who would dominate Asia. Initially, this conflict kicked off with both powers together ganging up on a weakened Qing China along with some other European powers, but Russia would in these initial stages take significant parts of Manchuria, including Outer Manchuria, that it still holds today. This is Vladivostok, and this bit you can see on the screen here. Japan, meanwhile, would grow to dominate the Korean peninsula, beating the crap out of China in the process, and war would kick off in 1905 between Russia and Japan over the region as Russia sought to extend its influence in the region at the cost of Japan, and Japan sought to do the same thing at Russia's expense. This is your typical Great Game, late imperial period. Both imperial powers wanted more land and more power. The 1905 war, as we would well know, go very poorly for Russia, with the cruiser Variag being sunk at the start of the war, Port Arthur falling, and in the end the Russian 2nd and 3rd Pacific Squadrons being bushwhacked at Tsushima. The aftermath of the First World War changed everything though, because this happened. Now, it's fair to say this had a bit of a political impact. Japan, for one, intervened in the east during the Civil War, and the more time it spent on mainland Asia, the more it liked it. This absolute shattering of the Russian, now Soviet position in Asia removed any obstacles Japan could conceivably have too. See, at the time Japan was in a very close alliance with the British Empire, who were really the only threat to them in Asia. But, and there is a big but here, thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty and subsequent talks, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, at the insistence of the United States, was broken, setting Japan out in the cold and leaving it to make its own choices. The reason behind this being that the British and American fleets were given parity at the Washington Naval Conference, and the thought was that if America went to war with Britain, then the Japanese Navy would rock up and absolutely bushwhack them, leaving them completely outnumbered. So it's understandable why they pushed for the treaty to be torn up, but as also at the same time it led to a lot of consequences down the line that I don't think a lot of us wanted. In 1931, the chicken would come home to roost with the Mukden incident, a very obvious false flag operation that gave the Japanese the army the pretext it needed to invade. The war itself in Manchuria would last 5 months, 1 week and 2 days, being all over by the 27th of February 1932, with the state of Manchuria being set up as a Japanese puppet state. The League of Nations complained, yes, but Japan walked out and totally ignored the completely useless and toothless board. During the war itself, the Imperial Japanese Army had learned valuable lessons from its use of imported and domestically produced tanks such as the Type 89E Go. These experiences highlighted the need for a lighter, faster vehicle capable of supporting infantry and conducting reconnaissance in areas where infrastructure was poor and road networks were limited. As 1933 rolled around, the Japanese Technical Bureau began development of this new light tank, based on these experiences, with the specific intent that it could serve alongside infantry units and cavalry formations. The project aimed to balance speed, mobility, and firepower while keeping costs and mechanical complexity relatively manageable. You have to keep in mind that Japan had survived the worst of the Great Depression through its seizure of Manchuria, while also undertaking a massive naval building program. It's not understating to say that without the Manchurian conquest, Japan was kinda screwed in the Great Depression. So this new tank had to be born in a world that really could not support it in a way that the Stuart could in the United States a few years later. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was tasked with the development, and after extensive field testing, the Type 95 light tank was formally adopted in 1935. The vehicle was given the name Hargo, yes weeaboos, I know I'm not adding the right inflections on it, touch grass, meaning the third model in the Army's designation system for tanks, and it started to be assigned to units. I just want to point out we're at the 5-minute point here. This was where the video was supposed to end. Oh well. The Type 95 Hargo embodied a design philosophy that explicitly emphasised simplicity, speed, and ease of production. Standing toe-to-toe with a large European tank on an open battlefield like the Matilda or the KV series was not something the designers planned or accounted for. Weighing approximately 7.4 tonnes, the tank was light enough to be easily transported by ship or train and operated on difficult terrain. It was powered by a Mitsubishi Type 94 air-cooled diesel engine producing about 110 horsepower, giving it a top speed of around 40 km on roads, which is a respectable figure for the 1930s. The use of a diesel engine was notable, as it reduced the risk of fire and improved fuel efficiency. This again was a very practical design choice given Japan's infamously limited access to petroleum. The Hargo would have a small crew with just 3 aboard, a commander who had multiple jobs including being a gunner for the main gun, a loader who would have access to the machine gun, and lastly a driver. The tank itself would have a very cramped interior, and the lack of crew inside would lead to, well, a lot of people being very busy at once. This is not entirely uncommon when you consider that other tanks at the time were also relatively cramped, but the number, well, it's something to keep in mind. Because the commander's side gig as a gunner would place a heavy workload on him during combat, and as time marched on, it proved it would be a massive hindrance for the tank in combat operations. The Hargo's armament consisted of a Type 94 37mm main gun mounted in a manually traversed turret. Now this might sound small, but remember it is 1933, and for 33 this weapon was more than adequate. Notice I said manually traversed as well. Yeah, well that's a lot of effort, especially when you're also having to fire and also having to command the tank, and well, you're starting to see some problems. The 37mm main gun was capable of penetrating light armour and providing support against infantry positions. Secondary armour included 7.7 Type 97 machine guns, 2 of them, one mounted in the hull at the front and the other at the rear of the turret, giving it an incredibly unique profile. Armour protection for the tank was pretty minimal, and this would be one of the key fatal flaws when it came to fighting the larger Western tanks that would face off against in the 40s. Protection ranged from 6 to 12mm of steel plate. The armour was designed to only resist small arms and shrapnel, reflecting the Japanese assumption that the tank's speed and manoeuvrability would allow it to avoid direct hits from heavy weapons. Suspension was provided by a bell crank system with 2 bogies per side, and this gave reasonable cross-country performance, but a bit of a rough ride. Overall, it was not a bad tank, especially when you consider its design purpose and the year it was designed and built. Also when you consider all the limitations thrown against it because of how it was built, and because of the situation it was born into. However, like with so many cases, it was built for the last war, and the last war was a completely different beast to what Japan would not be facing in the next war, but the war that came after it. There were 3 key fronts, or really wars, that you could say that included the Hargo. The first one, the one it was designed for, the Second Sino-Japanese War, starting in 1937, saw the tank performing pretty well against poorly equipped Chinese forces. The light armour of the tank was more than adequate when it came to dealing with Chinese anti-armour capabilities, or lack thereof, and the 37mm gun proved highly effective at breaking through fortified positions. When the Hargo came up against Chinese armour forces, it proved pretty effective against 3 battalions equipped with Panzer Is, CB-33s, and Vickers export models. The tank's armour was either good enough to deal with the incoming rounds, or its speed was fast enough to protect it in the open, and its weight meant that it did not suffer as much in the terrain. The lessons learned during this campaign's early years could and should have been used to improve the design of the vehicle, or create a newer and better tank for future purposes. However, the horrific infighting between the Navy and the Army meant that armour developments would now take a back seat, and any further advances would reduce to a crawl. This, in hindsight, was the tank's heyday, and well, it's all kind of downhill from here. To give you an idea, and this could be a whole video in itself on the inter-service rivalry between Japan's Army and its Navy, it got so bad to the point where the Army built its own aircraft carriers. Yeah, just seeing them on screen now, its own aircraft carriers. If the Army and the Navy of Japan could go to war with each other at this point in time, they probably would have. It's that bad. And the Hargo was one of the casualties of this. And then comes Zhukov. The consequences surrounding the lack of development of the Hargo really came to fruition during the Khalkhin Gol incident against the Soviet Union, where Japanese forces clashed with Soviet troops along the Manchurian-Mongolian border. See, in these battles, the Hargo was so decisively outclassed by the Soviet BT series of fast tanks, which had superior armour and firepower, that it wasn't really even funny. The encounter demonstrated the vulnerabilities of Japan's light armour doctrine and hinted at the growing obsolescence of the Hargo against well-equipped opponents, not that it really would make a difference. The battle began with a very mistaken belief that the Red Army was retreating from the area around the Khalkhin Gol River. This belief led the Imperial Japanese Army in command in Manchuria to order the 1st Tank Group under Lieutenant General Yasuke Masaomi to move to the village of Nomonhan to cut off what they thought were the withdrawing Soviet forces surrounding them and to force a surrender. After a 2-day train journey, the 1st Tank Corps began unloading its 3rd and 4th Tank Regiments at Ashan on the 22nd of June 1939. The 3rd Tank Regiment was largely equipped with the aging Type 89 medium tanks, almost 10 years old by then, but in contrast, the 4th Regiment, led by the 48-year-old Colonel Tamada Yoshio, fielded a varied force that included 35 Type 95 Hargo light tanks, 8 Type 89s, and 3 small Type 94 tankettes. What the Japanese did not account for, though, was General Yorki Zhukov, to take command at Nomonhan in June 1939. So Zhukov had already made his mark by integrating his fast-moving BT-5 and BT-7 tanks into combined attacks alongside infantry and artillery. These BT tanks were similar in size and crew to the Japanese Type 95s, but almost twice as heavy, weighing in at 13.8 tons. They were faster too, and much more heavily armed, but the Japanese didn't really think much of them, noting that their petrol engines made them dangerously flammable, especially against close-in-range tank killer teams armed with firebombs and other explosives. Think what the Finns did to the Soviet tanks with Molotov cocktails, same kind of concept. Japanese tank crews, because of this kind of hubris, tended to look down on Soviet armour as a whole, but it must be said they did have a healthy respect for the BT tank's 45mm gun. With muzzle velocities of more than 2,000 feet per second, Soviet rounds could punch through Japanese armour at ranges over a kilometre like a hot knife through butter. As one Japanese tank officer grimly recalled, no sooner did we see the flash than there'd be a hole in our tank, and the Soviets were good shots too. On the 2nd of July 1939, just after 6 PM, Colonel Tamada's 4th Tank Regiment, the one with the Hargo tanks, took the lead as the 1st Tank Corps launched its major offensive against Soviet positions along the Khalkhin Gol. The heavier 3rd Tank Regiment followed, pushing through intense artillery fire and becoming fully engaged at about 8 o'clock that evening. Meanwhile, Tamada's 4th Regiment veered southeast, steering clear of the worst barrages and clashing with Soviet units near Uzuru Pond. Spotting a Soviet artillery battery between his position and his objective, a juncture point further south, Tamada decided to attack under the cover of darkness, and at around 11 PM, his tanks began their advance, moving in tight formation, 6 metres between vehicles, 30 between companies and platoons. Just after midnight, helping the Japanese along, a thunderstorm rolled in, and this illuminated the battlefield with flashes of lightning. The downpour would actually reveal the Soviet positions as it masked the Japanese approach. Suddenly, lightning lit up the Type 95s, and the Soviet defenders opened up with everything they had: machine guns, artillery, BT-7s, anti-tank weapons, you name it, everything. But here's the kicker: the Japanese were already too close. The Soviet guns couldn't depress their barrels low enough, and most of their shells just flew overhead. At 12:20 AM, Tamada gave the order to charge. By 2 AM, his regiment had smashed more than 900 metres through Soviet lines, destroying a dozen artillery pieces. Japanese losses were light, with 1 Type 95 tank, 1 officer, and 1 enlisted man killed, along with 8 wounded. The regiment had fired off 1,100 rounds of 37mm ammunition, 129 shells from the 57mm guns, some 16,000 rounds from their machine guns, and after the battle, Soviet command reluctantly acknowledged that the Japanese 1st Tank Corps had managed to reach and overrun artillery positions. But the Soviets weren't done yet, and on the 9th of July, a Soviet counterattack threw the Japanese back, leading to 2 weeks of sporadic contact before on the 20th of August, with war looming in Europe, Zhukov decided, after taking a battering, to use the full might of the Red Army's numbers to end it. At 5:45 in the morning on the 20th, Soviet artillery and 557 aircraft attacked in what would be the first fighter-bomber offensive in the history of the Soviet Air Force. Following this assault, 50,000 Soviet and Mongolian soldiers of the 57th Special Corps attacked the east bank of the Khalkhin Gol. In rapid succession, 3 infantry divisions and a tank brigade crossed the river, pinning down the Japanese flanks. Soviet armoured units then took advantage of the situation, using their superior speed and firepower to sweep around the flanks and attack the Japanese in the rear, achieving a classic double envelopment. When the Soviet wings linked up by Nomonhan on the 25th of August, they trapped the Japanese 23rd Infantry Division, and this led to a failed Japanese counterattack on the next day. But what does this have to do with the Hargo? Well, see, the Hargos couldn't do anything to stop this. They were completely outclassed and outmatched by the BT series of tanks in speed, in firepower, and really all manners. The 27th would see the 23rd Division attempt to break out of the encirclement, but this would completely fail. The Japanese were now completely surrounded, and when these forces refused to surrender, they were hit again with artillery and air attacks. By the 31st of August, every Japanese soldier in Mongolia had either been killed or captured, and the border conflict was well and truly over. The USSR and Japan agreed to a ceasefire about 2 weeks later on the 15th of September, and it went into effect on the 16th at 10 minutes past 1. The Soviet tanks had simply wiped the floor with the Hargos and older Japanese models, but they simply could not stand against the speed and firepower of a modern tank. And this was against the BTs. This is a bit of a hint as to what's to come. Despite the absolute battering of the Hargos by Zhukov in Mongolia, Japan continued to use the tank widely in the early years of the Pacific War, particularly during its rapid conquest in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the forces assigned to seize the Southwest Pacific, namely the Malay Peninsula, Hong Kong, Wake, Guam, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Singapore, saw tremendous success. Against the lightly armed colonial forces of Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States in 1941 and 42, the Hargo again performed effectively. During the Malayan campaign, for instance, Hargo tanks played a key role in outflanking British defences, often advancing through terrain considered impassable for armoured vehicles. Their success was due in part to the element of surprise and the inability of Allied troops to counter even lightly armoured tanks in those early years. This all sounds well and good for the Hargo, but keep in mind, these Pacific garrisons of the Western powers had been completely pilfered for arms to be used in places like North Africa and Greece. This created the perfect storm for the Hargo's success, letting it go back to the role it was initially designed for. The cracks, though, were there. In the early skirmishes with Stuart tanks, it was reinforced that this little tank was simply not built to fight a modern armoured war in the 1940s. As the war continued on, the Hargo's weaknesses became increasingly evident. When confronted with newer Allied tanks such as the M3 Stuart with its king signed out, the M4 Sherman, and the brick wall that was the Matilda II, the 37mm gun was hopelessly inadequate. The tank's thin armour could be penetrated very easily even by light anti-tank weapons, and the lack of radios, and yeah, I didn't mention this earlier, but there were no radios in many early versions of this tank, limited coordination. During battles in the Philippines, the liberation that is, Guadalcanal and Burma, the Hargos were often destroyed in large numbers by better Allied tanks, or even by infantry equipped with anti-tank rifles and grenades. In fact, Japanese armour became such a joke that mortar teams in the US Marine Corps could render them useless by peppering them with high explosives, mission killing the tank, and sometimes even breaking through the armour and killing the crew on the inside with shrapnel. This occurred by some accounts during the Battle of Peleliu, and it's somewhat depicted in the miniseries The Pacific, although it's a bit iffy on that series. But there are some accounts of it occurring on other parts of the island near the airfield. Not exactly how it's depicted in the show, but the show kind of gives you an idea of how it would have worked. In short, the Hargo was Hargorn from being useful. Okay, that was cheap. That was very cheap, but you know.
Please clap.
Come on, I saw that. You didn't clap. The video won't continue unless you clap. Okay, better. Thank you. Thank you for that. My dopamine is now fulfilled. By the late stages of World War II, the Type 95 Hargo was completely useless, but Japan continued to produce it, and due to the nation's industrial limitations and the scarcity of more advanced designs, they didn't really have a choice. Around 2,300 units were built in total, making it one of the most numerous Japanese tanks of the war. Some were converted for other roles, including command vehicles, an armoured gun carrier, and while others served with Japanese naval infantry and puppet state forces in Asia. After Japan's defeat in 1945, captured Hargo tanks were used by several nations in post-war conflicts, including Indochina, the Chinese Civil War, once it kicked off again after the Second World War, and these tanks generally only served in secondary roles well into the 50s. Surviving examples today can actually be found in museums across Japan, of course, the United States and Southeast Asia. One of these museum pieces is actually located remarkably in good condition in far north Queensland at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum. I visited Oz Armourfest in 2025 and took some great footage that you have seen on screen periodically, and I personally think that this is a great little tank. According to the staff there, the tank is actually mostly completely intact, just caked in rust and, it's got a few other issues. which makes me both excited at the prospect of a future restoration of a running Hargo in Australia one day, if they decide to get it running, because let's be honest, how cool would that be if they pulled it off, but also sad that we will lose this gorgeous patina. There's also a spider that lives in the barrel, and his name is now Jeremiah, and any restoration work would make him homeless, so that would be very, very sad, wouldn't it? We should start a GoFundMe, I think, for a new home for Jeremiah. I think there's a Churchill not far from there that he could probably live in. Jokes aside, this museum is incredible, and I intend to be there for Alzheimer Fest 2026, where I hope to prod them more about fixing this tank because I just really like its vibes, personally. Post-production ho here. The Australian Armour and Artillery Museum put out a video on the Hargo yesterday that they have, and I am so excited to say that they're going to fix the damn thing and they're going to make it work. Take a look at this snippet from their video.
So today, we're previewing a future project for Daryl.
We're always thinking ahead of the projects we're going to do next, and one of the next projects is really exciting because they're extremely rare, and it's our Type 95 Hargo Japanese tank. We're so lucky to get this. This came out of a private collection from a bloke called Monty Wedd, who got it from a scrapyard after the Australian War Memorial got rid of it in the late 60s because they had a better one. It was captured in Rabaul at the end of the war. Tank restoration is a young man's game.
You're proving that statement wrong, Daryl, one day at a time. Looking forward to this one?
Absolutely. I get to play with stuff I thought I'd never see in my lifetime, so I cannot have a bigger smile on my face when it comes to stuff like this.
What's the timeline on this one, do you think?
Timeline, we've probably got another 6 months on the Wesp. Then we've got a lowercase Panzer IIc, and then I think this one will be next.
Thanks, Dazza.
Hey, no worries, mate. Come back in half an hour when I got out of this bloody thing.
Worth subbing to their channel if you haven't already. Most of you probably would have, but how cool is that? There's going to be a running Hargo in Australia. I am so excited for this. I'm going to try and sit in it one day. That's probably going to end up badly because I'm over 6 foot tall, but I'll still give it a go. In retrospect, the Hargo was a product of its time, effective in the early years of a Japanese expansion, but it was quickly outpaced by global tank development. Its lightweight construction, mobility, and reliability reflected Japan's early understanding of the need for mechanization, but its limited firepower and protection exposed the constraints of Japan's industrial base and doctrinal focus. And for this reason, I'm going to say with full confidence that the Hargo was not a bad tank. In fact, it was not bad at all. It was in some cases pretty good. It was good at being what it was designed to do. It was good at fighting infantry, breaking through hardpoints, and, working as a light reconnaissance tank. The whole purpose behind its construction. In the 1930s. This comes the rub. The moment it reaches the 1940s and it has to fight other tanks, it's completely outmatched. It's going to just get wiped with every single time. But that's not a fault of the tank, that's a fault of the doctrine, and I don't think you can blame the vehicle all too much for that. Yes, there are some significant limitations. You've got, for example, the commander has to do too many jobs at once, the lack of radios, the lack of space inside, the lack of armor. The firepower's pretty good, so you can't fault that too much. There are some key issues with it. But when you put it up against contemporary tanks from the 30s, such as the Panzer I and other contemporary tanks that the Vickers export that it fought in China, it's not the worst kind of tank that you could possibly imagine, particularly for that area and for that doctrine. It's actually pretty good. It's not bad at all. So, with all that said, I don't think you can call the Hargo a particularly bad tank. It's not amazing. I would say, for what it is, and for when it was built, yeah, it's pretty good. And it suffers the most because Japan completely falls apart with its ability to build and maintain newer and stronger tanks. Not to mention the fact that the Army and the Navy were completely at each other's throats. And during this time period as well, to add further context, the Navy is building multiple aircraft carriers, the Yamato-class battleships, a light cruiser class of the Yagano class, and they're planning more with the Oyodos. They're planning effectively what is the Japanese version of the Alaska-class supercruiser. They're building multiple heavy cruisers, dozens of destroyers, submarines including the I-400s. So, the Hargo and Japanese tank development, because keep in mind, Japan's Navy and the Army went back and forth on who dominated politics at any given time, because it's the Japanese state during the 1930s and the 40s that, like I said, the Army and the Navy would go to war with each other if they could. But that gives you the point of even if they had time to develop a tank, they wouldn't have had time to start building it before you start suddenly having this situation where you've got the other side currently in power taking over, which then forces tank development back on the back foot. Now, of course, there were tank projects during the Japanese Empire at this time period, but none of them really got going in a way that actually would have made a difference and would have mattered. Which, in hindsight, good thing for us, because Japan with actual good tanks, well, that would make them a bit more difficult to deal with. Not impossible, just a bit more difficult. So, with all that said, this was a 5-minute video. Put it on like plus 20 time speed. You know, when I started the 5-minute history thing like a few months ago, people started saying, you're going to be like Kinofel, and after about a week, you're going to start making hour-long content. You know what? We're on the path. We're on the path. We'll get there. But that was the first foray into tank content, and the first episode in the full-length videos of TANKMAS. The entire month that I will dedicate to tank content. You know, the content I said I would never do. So thank you all for joining me. Like, comment, subscribe. Check out the Patreon link in the description. Keep in mind that every short video this month, every one of the 5-minute history videos, which are mostly longer than 5 minutes, has been chosen by you guys, by the patrons, and by channel members. Channel members also have it that they can add to this list as well. So just keep that in mind. You want to pick topics for these themed months? Go ahead. Because I'm planning one in February that's going to be entirely based on French history, provided I can get it off the ground. So like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time.